found out about the so-called Clubhouse by sheer accident. One unassuming Tuesday afternoon when I drove out to my late father's estate in rural Oregon, intending to clear out old family memorabilia. My father had passed away 6 months prior, leaving me in charge of a sprawling property that held more memories than I could count. As his only child, I was responsible for handling every detail, legal, emotional, and otherwise. But when I pulled up to the estate that day, I caught a glimpse of something that made me stomp on the brakes. There, rising from behind a line of cedars, stood a brand new building that most definitely had not been part of my father's legacy. It looked suspiciously like a private clubhouse, complete with an ornate stone facade and a row of shiny golf carts parked out front. How, I wondered, how in the world did that monstrosity get here without my knowledge or consent? I stepped out of my car, still in disbelief, and walked closer. The smell of fresh lumber and paint was overpowering, a stark contrast to the estate's rustic ambiance. I had spent countless weekends in my father's final years discussing how we would preserve the land, maybe open small educational tours for local school kids, or host community events that honored his philanthropic spirit. He'd always joked that he wanted the property to remain the last piece of wild paradise in town, while apparently the local homeowners association had other plans. A large sign near the entrance read, "Property of the Sweetwater Meadows HOA, members only." My fists clenched. Was this some sick joke? The last time I checked, my father's property wasn't part of any neighborhood association, let alone one that had the nerve to erect a clubhouse on his land. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. Had someone forged documents? Or did the HOA just decide to expand onto land they thought was abandoned after my father's death? My father and I had long safeguarded this estate precisely because it was outside city limits and free from typical HOA rules. The estate was about 30 acres of rolling meadows, thick coniferous groves, and a small stream that ran through the eastern side. It was also home to deer, wild turkeys, and occasionally even a wandering black bear. I often retreated here in my younger years to find peace, to connect with nature, or to help Dad with small maintenance tasks that bonded us in a way city life never could. Now, I was staring at an invasive structure perched arrogantly on a once pristine hill. Who had authorized this, and why? When I marched up to the newly installed front door of that clubhouse, nobody tried to stop me. Workers roamed around, still hammering, painting, and landscaping. A few glimpses told me it was nearly complete. Inside, I glimpsed a large lounge area with plush sofas, an elaborate bar, and wide glass windows that overlooked my father's beloved orchard. The orchard he'd painstakingly maintained for decades. To see it overshadowed by this building made my blood boil. Then I heard someone call out, "Hey, you can't be in here." I turned to see a man wearing a neon safety vest, looking surprised and somewhat uneasy. I demanded to speak to whoever was in charge. He just shrugged, pointing to a corner office where I saw a door marked Project Manager. I wasted no time storming over there. Behind that door, I found an impeccably dressed woman bent over architectural plans. She looked up, startled for just a split second, and then her expression hardened into a polite but guarded mask. "Yes," she said coolly, drawing herself up to her full height. "Can I help you?" I took a deep breath and forced myself to maintain composure. "I'm Adam Lee," I said, my voice barely containing the anger simmering beneath. "This property belonged to my father, and I'd really like an explanation for why you're building a private clubhouse here." Her eyebrows arched, and she introduced herself as Miss Felicia Grant, president of the Sweetwater Meadows HOA. She spoke with the measured confidence of someone used to getting her way. "We have all the proper approvals," she stated, tapping a thick folder on her desk. "Your father's estate is under the jurisdiction of Sweetwater Meadows. This new clubhouse benefits the entire community. It's been in the planning stages for years. We notified the landowner multiple times but never received a response." Multiple times. I almost laughed in her face. My father never mentioned anything about being part of an HOA, let alone giving them permission to build on his land. The more she spoke, the more certain I became that something fishy was going on. I demanded to see the paperwork. She flipped open her folder, revealing a series of documents with official-looking stamps and signatures. Sure enough, there was a deed that supposedly annexed a large portion of my father's estate into Sweetwater Meadows, dated well before his passing. I scrutinized the signature. It was shaky, not at all like the strong, deliberate hand my dad had maintained until nearly the end. "I don't believe for a second that's my father's real signature," I said, my heart pounding. Miss Grant just gave me a small, condescending shrug. "If you have a complaint, file it, but as far as we're concerned, this land belongs to Sweetwater Meadows now, and this clubhouse will open next month, as scheduled." I left that office seething. Clearly, Miss Grant thought I was just some grieving son who couldn't handle the legalities. She had no idea that I'd recently been appointed county commissioner in a special election, an appointment so fresh that most people in the area wouldn't have recognized my name in that context. They only knew I'd been away in the state capital for training and orientation, returning to finalize personal affairs. My father's failing health had coincided with my campaign, and he passed away days before I took office. Understandably, I hadn't yet plastered my new position across local media, but Miss Grant had just made a serious mistake. She stepped onto what was legally private property, and more importantly, prime real estate my father had explicitly willed to me, forged paperwork or manipulated local records to claim it, and used intimidation to erect a structure that benefited only her exclusive HOA members. That, right there, was the definition of overreach. Despite my anger, a strategic part of my brain clicked on. Over the years, I'd witnessed how cunning officials or corporate players often met their downfall when they underestimated the quiet but determined folks who understood the law. Ms. Grant had no clue who she was up against. She also had no clue that, as county commissioner, I had the authority to review permits, question zoning changes, and push for investigations into suspicious land deals. That gave me an idea. Maybe I wouldn't show my hand right away. Maybe I'd gather evidence first. After all, if Miss Grant and her cronies had gone this far to annex property illegally, there had to be a trail of corruption. I wanted to dismantle not just their clubhouse, but the entire fraudulent scheme behind it. On the drive back to my apartment in the nearby town of Maplewood, I was so fired up that my hands kept gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. I made a list in my mind. First, talk to Dad's attorney. See if he'd heard anything about this alleged annexation. Second, pull the official county records on Sweetwater Meadows. Third, covertly utilize my new position to see exactly which county officials had signed off on this. Because forging my father's name was one thing, forging or bribing officials was another matter entirely. The next morning, I visited the small law firm that had handled my father's affairs for decades. His attorney, Mr. Sandoval, was an old family friend who looked downright furious when I explained the situation. "Adama, your father never signed any annexation documents," he insisted, cheeks flushed with anger. He was adamant about keeping that land free from any association entanglements. I have copies of all his real estate records, and none of them mention Sweetwater Meadows. I showed him the digital pictures I'd taken of Miss Grant's papers. He shook his head repeatedly, pointing out inconsistencies in the signature, the typed font, even the notarization details. "This is blatant fraud," he muttered, flipping through the images. "Let's confirm at the county clerk's office." So we did. We spent the rest of the day rummaging through official records, eventually finding that the annexation form had been filed a mere 2 months before my father died. The notary ID matched that of someone who hadn't been active for over a year, and the deed's witness signature was unreadable. I felt my stomach coil with rage and dismay. Ms. Grant must have orchestrated this, or at least facilitated it. But she wouldn't have done it alone. Sweetwater Meadows was a large HOA, with multiple subdivisions, known for its manicured lawns, strict paint color rules, and penchant for imposing hefty fines on residents who strayed from their guidelines. Over the past year, rumors had circulated that the HOA planned to expand aggressively, adding amenities like a pool, tennis courts, and now a full-fledged clubhouse. I suspected that certain county officials had bent the rules or turned a blind eye, maybe in exchange for personal gain. Corruption had a way of creeping into local politics, but as the newly minted county commissioner, I had a unique vantage point and the power to do something about it. That evening, I decided I wouldn't reveal my position to Ms. Grant just yet. Instead, I'd set a trap. I'd gather evidence of wrongdoing until it was undeniable, then spring it on her in a public, highly visible manner. She'd have no choice but to face the consequences. In the meantime, I filed an official complaint with the clerk's office, contesting the validity of the annexation. I also made discreet inquiries with my fellow commissioners, referencing a hypothetical case of property dispute. Those who seemed uneasy or defensive when I mentioned HOAs quickly landed on my mental shortlist of possible co-conspirators. Within a few days, I managed to confirm two major points. First, the environmental impact statements for the new clubhouse had been fast-tracked, bypassing typical review processes. That was odd. Second, the building permits had been signed off by a single county official named Ronald Pierce, an individual rumored to be Ms. Grant's friend. The official guidelines required multiple signatures, including a thorough inspection from the county planning board. None of that had been done. Pierce had, in effect, greenlit the entire project on his own authority. That reeked of corruption. A week later, I decided to pay a visit to Mr. Pierce's office under the guise of a typical meet and greet. After all, I was the newly appointed commissioner, so it wouldn't raise suspicion that I wanted to talk about local development. Pierce was a stout man in his early 50s, with a forced smile that never quite reached his eyes. He kept wringing his hands as we spoke, looking over my shoulder like he expected Ms. Grant to appear at any moment. "Commissioner Lee," he said, straining his voice to sound casual. "I'm so glad you dropped by. What can I do for you?" I studied his face, taking a moment before replying. "I heard there's been some significant development in Sweetwater Meadows, a new clubhouse, right? I thought I'd take a quick look at how that came about. Anything you can share?" He cleared his throat, beads of sweat forming on his brow. "Oh, that's all above board," he insisted, flipping through documents with shaky fingers. "Just your standard rezoning and building approvals. The HOA handled everything responsibly." I forced a friendly smile, nodded, and left without pressing further. I'd learned plenty just by watching him squirm. Later that day, I drove out to Dad's estate again to see how construction had progressed. I was shocked to see that the clubhouse appeared nearly finished, with workers now focusing on landscaping, planting hedges, installing a fancy fountain, and even leveling sections of the land to pave a parking lot. The brazen disregard for any potential pushback stunned me. Ms. Grant clearly believed she had the law on her side, or at least enough county enablers to shut down any opposition. As I walked around, taking photos of the development, a security guard approached me. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he said, posture rigid. I glared at him. "I'm the owner of this property. You have no authority to kick me off." He looked puzzled, then repeated his line about it belonging to the HOA. Rather than argue, I collected more pictures, let them think I was powerless. Soon enough, they'd realize their entire operation was built on a lie. That evening, I found two surprising allies in the community. The Rogers, an older couple who lived on the edge of Sweetwater Meadows. They'd read about my father's passing and reached out to me, claiming they were suspicious of Miss Grant's methods. Over sweet tea at their kitchen table, the couple recounted how Miss Grant had threatened them with fines for non-compliant lawn ornaments unless they supported the new clubhouse project. "We've lived here for 30 years, Mrs. Rogers said, voice trembling. "We've never dealt with such hostility from an HOA before she took over as president." Mr. Rogers nodded solemnly, adding that they'd also heard about forged signatures on other occasions. Residents who suddenly found themselves agreeing to new HOA rules they had never actually endorsed. It all painted a picture of an HOA president who was as ruthless as she was ambitious, and though Ms. Grant might have had local connections, she didn't know she was meddling with the newly appointed commissioner, who also had personal stakes in the matter. Even with the Rogers' moral support, I knew I needed hard evidence to bring Ms. Grant down. My father's attorney and I set up a discreet meeting with the district attorney, laying out the suspicious documents. The DA was intrigued. "This definitely warrants further investigation," she said. but we'll need something concrete to prove Ms. Grant or Mr. Pierce knowingly committed fraud. I proposed a plan. We'd request an official audit of the Sweetwater Meadows HOA records, including their financial statements, membership rolls, and any documentation regarding the clubhouse. As commissioner, I had the authority to launch such an inquiry if I believed county procedures were violated. The DA agreed, emphasizing we needed to keep it low-key so Miss Grant wouldn't have time to destroy evidence. It was risky. If Miss Grant caught wind, she might tip off her allies, but I sensed we were on the verge of something explosive. 2 days later, I made my move. I called a special session of the county commission, placing HOA development oversight on the agenda. My fellow commissioners, mostly folks who had no real stake in Miss Grant's scheme, approved my motion to open an investigation. Mr. Pierce sat at the far end of the table that day, sweating bullets and occasionally shooting me nervous glances. I played it calm, not revealing the personal dimension behind the investigation. Publicly, I framed it as ensuring all neighborhoods comply with the county's building and environmental regulations. Privately, I knew I had Ms. Grant in my crosshairs. The following morning, an official letter was delivered to Sweetwater Meadows HOA, demanding that Ms. Grant produce all building permits, environmental impact assessments, and financial records related to the clubhouse. I pictured her reaction as she read it. The realization that an unforeseen tide of scrutiny was about to wash over her carefully orchestrated plans. Meanwhile, rumors spread among residents. Some cheered quietly, hoping Miss Grant's dictatorial reign would end. Others feared retribution if they spoke out. I spent my lunch breaks at local diners, hearing stories from people who felt steamrolled by the HOA. Each account fueled my determination to see justice done. A few days later, Ms. Grant tried to fight back in the court of public opinion. She organized a grand preview event at the nearly completed clubhouse, inviting local dignitaries, business owners, and even the press. The event was billed as a charity fundraiser, implying that the clubhouse was built to serve the community's greater good. I debated whether to show up uninvited. Ultimately, I decided that attending might give me a chance to gather more intel. So that weekend, I arrived at the estate. My estate, dressed in a nondescript blazer, doing my best to blend in as a curious onlooker. The clubhouse glowed with fancy lights, waiters circulated with trays of hors d'oeuvres, and the sound of a live jazz band floated through the crisp evening air. It was a grand spectacle, no doubt orchestrated by Ms. Grant to dazzle potential supporters. And there she was, standing by the massive windows that overlooked the orchard, wearing a fitted black dress, exuding confidence. When she spotted me across the room, her eyes narrowed. She walked over, flanked by 2 board members who had the uneasy look of minions caught between loyalty and self-preservation. "I'm surprised to see you here," she said in a measured tone that barely concealed her annoyance. I gave a polite smile. "It's my father's property, after all," I replied, letting the words linger. Watching her jaw tense, she recovered quickly. "It's not your property if the HOA has the deed," she countered, voice tinged with a smugness I found nauseating. The annexation was perfectly legal. I pretended to ponder her statement. "We'll see," I said softly. I could tell she wanted to question me further, but a local businessman approached, congratulating her on the visionary project, and she had to play the gracious host. I spent the rest of the evening observing, eavesdropping, and occasionally snapping discreet photos on my phone. I noted how certain local officials seemed excessively friendly with Miss Grant, patting her on the back, exchanging hushed, conspiratorial smiles. These were the same folks who likely bypassed standard procedures for her. My anger simmered, but I reminded myself I was setting a trap, and they were strolling right into it. Let them think they'd gotten away with it all. In the ensuing days, I contacted a forensic document examiner recommended by the DA. We had him analyze the questionable deed Ms. Grant claimed showed my father's signature. His preliminary findings were exactly what we suspected, a probable forgery. Stroke patterns mismatched Dad's known handwriting, the date was tampered with, and the notary seal was flagged as outdated. By now, the DA had enough basis to start building a criminal case, but she wanted the county's own investigation to run parallel, ensuring we had a full picture of how deep the rot went. My private life became consumed with this battle. I neglected other parts of my job as commissioner, letting routine matters slip to the side. A small voice in my head whispered that maybe I was crossing a line by using my office to wage a personal war, but I reminded myself that it wasn't just personal. Ms. Grant had likely done this to others, or would do it in the future if she wasn't stopped. The thought of Dad's orchard overshadowed by a tacky clubhouse, filled with people who had no respect for the land's history, ignited me to press forward. One afternoon, I received a panicked call from Mr. Rogers. Apparently, Ms. Grant had posted brand new HOA regulations, including hefty amenity fees for anyone living within a mile of the new clubhouse, whether they wanted to join or not. "They're threatening to put liens on our homes if we don't pay," Mr. Rogers said, voice trembling with frustration. "We never asked for a clubhouse. We're retirees on a fixed income." My blood boiled. This woman was literally terrorizing elderly residents into funding her vanity project on land she'd stolen. That was it. I dialed the district attorney's number, my voice steely. "We have to move on this now. People are getting extorted. Let's push for an injunction." The DA agreed. She filed the paperwork to freeze all HOA activities related to the clubhouse, pending a full judicial review of the annexation. The judge, having seen the forensic evidence of possible forgery, signed off. A court order arrived at Ms. Grant's office the next morning, halting any further construction, membership drives, or financial demands tied to the new clubhouse. I couldn't wait to see the look on her face. Sure enough, within hours she tried calling me directly, presumably having discovered my role not only as the estate's rightful heir, but also as county commissioner. I let it go to voicemail. She left a curt message. "Commissioner Lee, this is Felicia Grant. We need to talk about this misunderstanding. Please call me back." I smirked. She'd shown me nothing but arrogance before. Now she wanted to talk? She must have realized the walls were closing in. I decided to make her sweat a bit longer. I waited until the following day to respond. When I finally called her, she sounded almost pleading, an unfamiliar tone from the normally imperious Miss Grant. "There's been a terrible mix-up," she said. "I had no idea the annexation might have been invalid. I promise we can find a solution that works for everyone." I let her run in circles for a minute, making vague assurances. Then, calmly, I told her, "Miss Grant, that land was never yours to build on. You've committed multiple violations. I suspect you've also bribed or coerced officials to bypass county regulations. If there's any solution to be found, it'll be through the legal system. I'm just giving you a heads up, the next time we speak, it might be in a courtroom." She tried to protest, but I hung up. The time for polite conversation had passed. In the weeks that followed, the county's official investigation and the DA's criminal case ramped up. Witnesses came forward, including staff members who'd quietly resigned from the HOA after seeing shady bookkeeping. They testified to odd cash withdrawals, suspicious gift receipts for local officials, and letters from Ms. Grant instructing them to shred outdated documents. People who'd been terrified of her retribution now felt empowered by the fact that a commissioner was leading the charge. Mr. Pierce, cornered by the inquiries, tried to salvage his reputation. He admitted that Miss Grant had promised him a lucrative position in the HOA if he expedited permits for the clubhouse. The scale of the corruption was staggering. Meanwhile, Miss Grant herself maintained a facade of innocence, claiming to have been misled by her own staff. But that story fell apart when the district attorney unveiled email chains linking Miss Grant directly to the forged deed. The final blow came when we discovered that Miss Grant had authorized an expensive sculpture garden on the estate's western edge, carving up a portion of my father's orchard to create an exclusive walkway for visiting HOA members. That was personal. She destroyed fruit trees older than I was, trees that had grown from seedlings my father planted before I was born. I asked the DA if we could add property destruction to the list of charges. She assured me we could if we established the orchard was intentionally wrecked without the landowner's permission. At this point, Ms. Grant didn't stand a chance. When the court date arrived, the hearing drew a huge crowd. Reporters, local residents, even high school students on field trips to learn about civic processes, all packed into the gallery. The Rogers sat near the front, clasping hands anxiously. Mr. Pierce had already accepted a plea deal in exchange for testifying against Ms. Grant. My father's attorney stood beside me, quietly confident. The judge's gavel rang out, silencing the murmurs. The DA presented a succinct but damning case, showcasing the forged signature, the rushed permits, and the coerced residents. Pierce took the stand, voice trembling, admitting he had illegally approved the clubhouse construction after Miss Grant promised him financial incentives. Miss Grant's defense floundered, trying to paint her as a victim of incompetent staff. But the email evidence contradicted that. At one point, the DA read aloud an email in which Ms. Grant explicitly instructed an employee to make sure the old man's signature looks legit. My stomach churned at the callous reference to my father. Finally, I was called to testify, not only as the rightful heir but also as the county commissioner overseeing the investigation. I explained how I stumbled upon the clubhouse, my suspicions, and the subsequent steps that confirmed the fraud. Ms. Grant avoided my eyes during my testimony, her face drained of the confidence she displayed at the clubhouse gala. She looked like a cornered animal realizing the trap had sprung. As I finished speaking, a hush fell over the courtroom. The judge nodded solemnly, acknowledging my statement. The air felt thick with the weight of everything Ms. Grant had done. In the end, the jury's verdict was swift. Ms. Grant was found guilty of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit bribery. The judge ordered the dismantling of the clubhouse, the reversion of the land to its rightful owner, me, and significant restitution to the residents who had been coerced into paying extra HOA fees. The orchard that had been partially torn up would be replanted at Ms. Grant's expense, per the judge's direct. Moreover, the judge made it clear that Ms. Grant would face separate criminal sentencing for her actions. I felt a rush of vindication, tempered by sadness at what the estate had endured. Dad's orchard would need years to recover fully, and the land was scarred by construction, yet justice had been served. As we walked out of the courtroom, reporters thrust microphones into my face, asking how I felt. Relieved, I answered, voice trembling slightly. It's a tragedy that my father's legacy had to be defended in court, but I'm grateful justice prevailed. They also asked about Ms. Grant's downfall. I simply said she walked right into her own mess, and this county won't tolerate corruption. The footage made headlines on local news that night, the story framed as a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and the importance of honest governance. More than a few commentators noted how Ms. Grant had never realized she'd built her dream project on land owned by the new county commissioner, a detail that made the story all the more sensational. A month after the trial, I returned to the estate with a small group of volunteers to start restoring the orchard. The judge's order meant Ms. Grant had to fund the necessary saplings, mulch, and soil treatments, but she was no longer around to see it. Her bail had been revoked after another layer of financial crimes emerged. Funny how fast a facade crumbles when people start digging. As we planted the new trees, I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. My father had dreamed of keeping this land pristine, a haven of natural beauty. While we couldn't undo all the damage, we could at least honor his wish by ensuring no HOA would ever encroach on it again. I also worked with the Rogers and other community members to draft new local ordinances that increased oversight of homeowners associations, preventing them from annexing properties without explicit, verifiable permission. We established stiffer penalties for forging documents and bribing officials. The local paper wrote a glowing editorial about Commissioner Lee's push for reform, praising me for turning a personal fight into a community-wide victory. I never intended to become a poster child for landowner rights, but if it helped protect others from Ms. Grant's fate, I was happy to wear that label. In the end, the clubhouse was torn down piece by piece. Some of the materials were donated to local charities that repurposed construction supplies. The land, with time and care, reverted to open space dotted with young orchard saplings. When I stood on that grassy hill once covered by stone walls and manicured patios, I felt a profound peace. Gone were the towering columns of Ms. Grant's vanity project. Gone were the prying eyes of security guards who dared to call me a trespasser on my father's property. All that remained was an expanse of gentle hills, a modest orchard, and a memory of triumph. The wide sky overhead felt brighter, almost as though the estate itself was breathing a sigh of relief. A few neighbors asked if I planned to open the land for public events in honor of Dad's philanthropic spirit. Maybe, I told them. For now, I wanted to heal the estate, to let nature reclaim what had been disrupted. But I did invite local youth groups to visit the orchard, to learn about the land, to see how new saplings might one day bear fruit that future generations would enjoy. Every time I watched a child's face light up at the sight of a budding blossom, I thought of Dad and how proud he'd be that we'd kept the estate free from unscrupulous hands. From time to time, I'd get a call or email from someone congratulating me on destroying the HOA. I always clarified that HOAs aren't inherently evil. They can serve a purpose if run ethically. But Ms. Grant had turned Sweetwater Meadows into a personal fiefdom, using intimidation, forgery, and bribery to feed her ambition. If not for the false annexation that threatened my father's legacy, she might have kept exploiting residents unchecked. In a strange way, her downfall taught the entire community a lesson about vigilance and accountability. We sometimes need a dramatic example, a private clubhouse scandal, to awaken people to the importance of transparency in local governance. About a year after the dust settled, I hosted a small gathering on the estate, inviting close friends, some commissioners, and neighbors like the Rogers. We had a modest barbecue near the orchard, enjoying the warm summer breeze. I gave a brief speech thanking everyone who had stood up against Miss Grant's tyranny. My voice wavered a bit when I mentioned Dad. I said I hoped we'd honored his memory by reclaiming the land and ensuring it remained a piece of Oregon's natural beauty. The group applauded softly, lifting their glasses in a toast. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the orchard's new saplings cast long shadows across the grass, a testament to how quickly life could regenerate when nurtured with care. Sometimes I still feel a twinge of regret that things had to escalate into a court battle. Maybe if Miss Grant had possessed a modicum of respect, she could have approached me, explained her vision, and we could have found a mutually beneficial arrangement. But forging my father's signature, bulldozing part of the orchard, and extorting older residents left me no choice. She walked into my estate thinking she owned the place. She walked into the county offices assuming she could bully or bribe her way around the law. In the end, she walked right into my trap, the trap of accountability, justice, and undeniable truth. As for Sweetwater Meadows, the HOA elected a new board that spent the next year repairing its reputation, rescinding many of Ms. Grant's draconian regulations, and issuing refunds to residents she'd harassed. They even reached out with a formal apology for their former president's conduct, though I suspect it was partly damage control. I graciously accepted, letting them know I bore no ill will toward the community itself, only the corruption that had seeped in under Miss Grant's reign. Life moved on, the scandal faded from daily chatter, replaced by new local dramas and politics. Yet every time I visit my father's estate, I'm reminded of how close we came to losing it to greed. In quieter moments, I wander among the orchard's rows, letting my fingers brush the budding leaves, inhaling the sweet air. This is what Dad wanted. A place that remains tranquil, organic, free of the rigid lines and neon signs that so often define modern development. Thanks to a twist of fate and Ms. Grant's overconfidence, his estate remains intact, a living tribute to the man who taught me to stand up for what's right, even when faced with powerful adversaries. And that's exactly what I did. They tried to take it all, to profit off our land with a private clubhouse they had no right to build. But they never dreamed the man they dismissed as just another heir was actually the newly appointed county commissioner. They never saw the trap until it was too late, and in that final moment, when Ms. Grant realized the law was no longer on her side, my father's legacy emerged victorious.